I'm going to talk today about making paint. I have always made my own paint for two reasons really. One is that I use an enormous quantity, and secondly, making my own paint is a way of getting the purest possible colour. So I want to explain today where paint comes from and how I use it and how I make it. And it's really very simple. As I explained before in my introductory video, I have understood that paint is made from actually watercolour paint, as this is, from three ingredients. One is the pigment, the second is the carrier, which I shall explain later, that's the gum arabic, and thirdly it's the water. Now these three parts of paint making are very easily applied, they're very easily mixed, and it's fun to do, and what is more, it saves you a lot of money. So let's start. Where does pigment come from? Pigment comes from all sorts of places, and these days most pigments are synthetic. They are constructed through chemical compounds, and most of these modern pigments were developed through the dye industry and the car industry. But I'm talking about the earth pigments, the ones which I use for landscape and which most landscape painters do use as well. So this pigment, where does it come from? I've got here some very good examples of real pigment. This is rock, basically. And the reason I'm demonstrating this to you is that the very famous Impressionist painter, Paul Cézanne, he used this colour a lot in his paintings of Saint Victoire down in Provence. And he painted a lot of this subject matter. He really did. He painted many pictures of Mont Saint Victoire. And the reason was because by the time he was painting, Impressionists were to a penny, there were a lot of them, and he wanted his paintings to reflect subject matter that was real, not just an impression, but real subject matter, namely the mountains. And very similar to myself, he got very much interested in the rock formations and the way mountains looked in different lights and at different times of the day, just like I do. And so he developed his wonderful set of paintings down in Provence. This pigment is from the earth around Mont Saint Victoire. And when I was down there, I picked up this lump. I used my muller, as we call it, which we use on glass, to grind it. And in so doing, applying the gum arabic and the water, I made this paint. And Saint Victoire, Provence. So something to remember Cézanne from. But to get back to my pigment, I'm in the middle of mixing up some new pigment, which has actually lasted me a very long time, and it is my basic one, which is golden ochre. This golden ochre, I think this particular ochre, comes from France. But you can find golden ochre, and many of the ochres, green ochres, brown ochres, orange ochres, all around Europe and all around in all parts of the world. It's a very common earth pigment, and it goes right back to prehistoric days when the cave painters used this very same pigment for doing their paintings. Earth paintings have the advantage of being light fast. They very rarely fade. And so when you're using earth pigments, you know that your paintings are going to stay the same way as when you finish them. To get back to my method of mixing, I'm going to show you how I do it with the three basic ingredients. So I put my pigment out. a little. I apply my gum arabic. I have two forms of gum arabic here. One is the pure liquid gum arabic, which I made this year from the original. This is the original resin, which has come from the tree, but I use a powdered form, which is much simpler to use. You can use either, but it's more laborious to grind this up. And when mixed with water and strained through a muslin bag, it comes out as a liquid. Then what we do, we need to add a bit of preservative. I use honey, because honey is a natural preservative. It is a sugar. It is not refined. It is a pure natural preservative. And I mix it with the gum arabic and I get a liquid like that. Then my water. By technical standards, one should use mineral water, but that's a bit of a chore. So I use filtered water because I have a very high content of chlorine in my water, and we don't want to bleach the colours that we're already trying to preserve. So anyway, this is filtered water. So what I do is I add a little, just enough to cover the surface, that quantity, and then with my liquid gum arabic and honey, I pour a little bit over the top, almost the same as the quantity of the water, and away I go. These earth pigments, they blend very, very quickly and very easily. Some pigments take a bit more manhandling. Perhaps they're not ground as finely. Perhaps they've got additives in that resist the liquid penetrating the powder. But this is part of the fun, because you do have to experiment somewhat when mixing paint. It's a bit like cooking in your kitchen. When you're making a sauce, you either get it too thin, you get it too thick, you get it too gelatinous, and then eventually you get it dead right. So there we are. I've made my paint. It's all ready to go. And then I next have to jar it up. I would recommend, if you're making paint and storing it, that you use sterilised jars. A bit like jam making, it's one and one of the same thing. We want it to last. And in it goes. Doesn't have to be too much. You don't have to fill it to the brim, because you can always come back and make more. This paint, which has been handmade, unlike tube paint, can be re-moistened again. How many tubes of paint did I used to throw away because I hadn't used them? They're hard. Impossible to reactivate. But homemade paint is much more concentrated, it is much more lasting, and it is really a much more economical buy. Apart from that, of course, you can do your own recipes of colours. I have a recipe book here of all my pigments that I've made, and some of them get quite experimental. And by Jove, it really is useful to be able to flip through this book, see what I've used, and tip out onto my glass to make that one pigment that I want for that specific painting. So there you are, a very easy little method to improve your painting 1,000 times. The colours will be brighter, your paint will be easier to apply, and you'll have fun mixing more and more tones.